very much for your welcome, and I'd like to say it's a pleasure indeed to be back here again with you. I have to apologize for being a bit incommunicado, but as my good brother stated, that's been the result of the fact that I've been at completing a book, a short one, and often when you can't escape the city, you sort of have to pretend you're out of town, you know, to wrap it up. And writing a book is very much like when you're playing athletics, you get into a state of mind or consciousness, or what we call, you get your concentration on, you really try not to break it. So I have to apologize to my friends and others who sort of tried to get through and found it difficult. I managed to finish the galley there last week, and hopefully in February we'll have the first edition of the black-on-black violence, sort of dealing with black criminality, but particularly with the violence that we often express one toward the other, and how that is brought about by the social political circumstances under which we are forced to survive. And there are a couple of there's another book that's being developed too, which we expect to be out soon as well. You may also look forward to a short book on the education of the African child, of the African American child. It's probably around March or April. I've found it so important that we get our material out, and I'm making them short because at this point we really don't have the time to put in 2 and 3 and 4 years into developing books in terms of the challenges that we face as people nowadays. The lecture tonight, of course, will be as written on your flyer, Developing the Undeveloped Minds of Children of African Ancestry. I will have to say that you can consider this lecture part 1 on this particular subject matter. I will complete it at the African Portrait Theater Sunday. I believe it's scheduled for around 5:30. I'll have to apologize perhaps to the others who are sort of used to what may be called my more dynamic style of delivery tonight. I'm going to be a bit more professorial, and therefore it means maybe a bit more boring, maybe a bit more, I may tend to put some of you to sleep. But I'm going to risk that in light of the importance of the subject matter. And therefore I prefer to emphasize the information than the entertainment, because I think we face such dire problems and circumstances until we really need to do a close analysis of our situation. And we need to come away from these kind of occasions with working knowledge, with information we can use, not just a good feeling, not a good stroking, and so forth. Not that other speakers leave us without information, but I think in terms of myself, I want to emphasize that a bit more. Sometimes that sort of takes away from the dynamism of the lecture itself. That's another reason why I'm sort of breaking this lecture up into 2 parts, because when we talk about developing the undeveloped mind of our children, we should take the time to analyze the situation and to analyze the minds of our children and how those minds have been created. You cannot appropriately talk about the education of black children without understanding what we call the cognitive style of black children and the behavioral style of black children. I wrote the developmental psychology of the black child for one major reason, And that major reason is the fact that when you talk of rearing children, and when you talk of educating children, you should have a knowledge of their developmental psychology. One of the major problems with the New York educational system and with the American education system, and in fact with the African educational system in Africa and other places, is that those systems are not based on a knowledge of the developmental psychology of African children. I've stated on other occasions that a school system that pedagogical approaches, that is teaching approaches, that the content and design of curricula are based on an implicit child. When to teach a particular subject matter, what subject matter is to be taught, how that subject matter is to be taught, what the content will be and so forth, is based upon what we call an implicit theory of the development of the person or individual that you are going to teach. In other words, we decide to teach children reading at particular points, certain types of math at particular points in their life, social studies, science, and other things, because we feel that they have a certain readiness due to their biological maturation and due to their social experience. So consequently, if you're going to do a competent job of educating children, you should have a knowledge of their basic developmental psychology, a knowledge of their basic developmental, biological, and psychological orientation. Otherwise, there will be a mismatch between what is being taught, how developmental history, and the child's developmental orientation. We have to recognize then that schools in America, and in particular schools in New York City, are built around the implicit white child, the developmental psychology of the white child. I don't have time here tonight to show you a profile of the so-called mental abilities, let us say, of the Jewish child, the Chinese child, the Puerto Rican and black child tonight, to show you the differences in the organization of those abilities and the differences in the level of those abilities between these sets of children. If you saw those organizational systems and the levels that differentiate these children, you can see immediately then that a school system based upon the psychology of Jewish children will by its very nature, by its very structure, destroy the intellectual potential of black children. So you have to have a knowledge of who your children are if you are to appropriately educate them and design an appropriate educational experience for them. And one of the major problems then that we have had as a people is that we do not know our children, and consequently we have a difficulty in designing the appropriate educational experience for them. You have to come to understand that very clearly. Our children are not, as I've said so often, white children who happen to be black. There are substantial psychological, biological, and other differences between the black child and the white child. The education then of black children is not a matter of mere color. The psychology of our children, as I've stated on other occasions, and the psychology of our people is the result of the historical experience of our people. The psychology that is used in educating children today is a psychology based on the history and experience of Europeans. Consequently, then, the educational approach based on that psychology is inadequate for meeting the educational needs of African people and of our children. However, our children are blamed for this mismatch. They are then described in terms of deficiencies and deviances and defects and other kinds of things that we hear so much about in the everyday world. You as an individual are your history, and your psychology is the result of your history. Therefore, I cannot use your history and the psychology that flows from that history to adequately define the behavior of another individual. That the behavior of the other individual must be defined and described in terms of that individual's history and experience. The same thing applies when we talk about a people. The psychology of black people and the psychology of black children it flows from the history and experience of black people. The behavior and the orientation of black children today carries in them the history and experience of black people for the past several thousands, if not millions, of years. We've indicated that the genetic inheritance that our children receive, the genes that our children carry, are not mere chemical packets that determine their physiological aspects. But the genes are capsulated histories of the experience of our people. In other words, the cultural history, the biological history, the climatic, geographical history of our people, the interaction our people have had with other peoples, the interactions our people have had with their environment on the African continent and other places over the thousands and thousands of years are carried right in the bodies of our children and is a part of their psychology as well as their biology. And therefore, the education of our children must be based on the knowledge of that history and the psychology that flows from that history. The other thing, of course, that we must recognize, and that we'll talk a great deal about here this evening, is that the education of a people must depend upon the problems that people have to solve. And many of you have heard me say again and again that the destiny of the black child is revolutionary, that the destiny of the white child is conservative, that the major thing that the white child must do is to maintain the advantages that whites already have and to add to those advantages. When we talk of the black child and the black people as being disadvantaged, we have referred to the fact that we do not have our share of what this world has to offer. And when we recognize that we will have to take that share from other people, and that we will have to be able to protect that share once we take it, we then must recognize that the destiny of our children is revolutionary, and that we are in a sense preparing our children for warfare. That means then that they must be reared to take on those tasks. That means that they must be educated to undertake those tasks. That means ultimately then that they cannot be reared or educated in the same ways white children are reared or educated. They must be educated and reared to undertake their appropriate tasks in the world. And then we then have to design their education in terms of their destiny. And I've said on other occasions, and I'll repeat here again tonight, that there is no such thing as standard education. There is no such thing as equal education. These things you must get out of your minds. They will destroy you. There is no universal, non-ethnic, non-political type of education. Education is political to its very core. It's ethnic to its very core. And anybody that deceives you into thinking that you're going to get the same education with the same result as another people is making a fool of you. And you have to rid yourself of those ideas. You're being destroyed by that concept. There's no such animal as standard of equal or the same as, particularly when you have different tasks to accomplish. We're going to then approach this issue tonight in terms of what we call information processing. Just how does the mind process information? So the lecture tonight will be relatively general. We're just going to kind of get an overall view of the mind and how it is developed and how it is influenced by its environment and how it influences its environment. Sunday, we will look at the particular characteristics of the black child's cognitive style. So once we look at the particular characteristics, then we know exactly how our children must be educated. It's not enough for you to go to the new commission and say, we want our children to have a better education. You must be able to, what we call in psychology, operationally define what a better education means. That is, you got to be able to list and state in terms of technique, method of approach, and content exactly what you mean when you say you want your children to have a better education. And this has been one of the problems we've had. You know, we talk about better education, the same education, standard education, without any definition. You must be able to go down to this commissioner's desk, to the chancellor's desk there, with an educational manual that lays out step by step exactly how you want your children educated, with the rationale of why you want them educated that way, and how you plan for that education to be integrated into the school system. That manual should be a part of all of your community boards and district boards so that they can use it to implement an educational program across the system. In other words, you have to be specific. You have to know what you want and how to get where you want to go. But in order to do that, you got to know in particular sort of ways how your children think, how they behave, how the system has organized them to behave, how it has organized them to think, so that you'll know exactly how you want to reorganize their mental and behavioral structures. In terms of generality, I've talked about how, in a sense, we can get a broad concept of how the black child thinks and behaves by trying to answer the question, how must that child behave and how must that child think? How must black people behave, African people behave, how must African people think if the European is to maintain his power and domination over black people? In other words, you must meditate on this question. If you were in power, how would you prefer that the people you rule over behave? What kind of mental characteristics would you prefer that they have? Of course, you want them to be passive, wouldn't you? You want them to be obedient, wouldn't you? You want them to love you even though you kick them up their butt and mistreat them, wouldn't you? You want them to think that you're the greatest in the world, that you're the smartest, that you're invincible, that they're the dumbest and stupidest and the whole bit, wouldn't you? And that'll make life very nice for you, wouldn't it? Then you have to recognize this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk a little later on about what I call the theory of racial complementarity. You know, how one race in power tries to design another race to complement its power, you see. And what kind of mind and personality and behavioral orientation it must introject into the subordinate race in order to stay in power. How must their thinking capacities be limited, or if they're not limited, how must they be restricted in their scope so that one race can stay in power and another out of power? And you can show them that you can work out the mental characteristics and behavioral characteristics of that subordinate race in very fine detail. Once you answer those questions, once you answer that central question, and look at it very closely, look at the characteristics that must be introduced into the minds of the subject people, then if you're serious, and I'm emphasizing that because I really wonder how many of us are really serious, period. If you're serious about getting out of that situation, you'll know exactly how your children are to be reared and educated to be gotten out of that situation. So we're going to start on this track tonight. Stick with me, stay awake. We're going to go through it here, and I'm going to try to keep it as interesting as I can. However, I want you to listen to me carefully as I sort of go through the paradigm here. We're going to look then at the information processing approach to understanding the minds of our children. The information processing approach is defined in the standard developmental psychological text, and I'm mainly using the one by Tapvideo and Amos, refers to the analysis of the processes underlying intelligent behavior, or how we do what we do. I'm taking this approach because I think it's a valuable approach. There's a difference between being told that your child has an IQ of a 90 or 100 or 70 or 150 and being told how your child thinks, how your child processes information, how it solves problems, you see, or fails to solve problems. And one of the reasons it solves problems or fails to solve problems. When you're given the latter type of information, you're given a program, you see. You're giving a basis upon which you can operate to transform the behavior and orientation of your child. But for someone to say, well, he has an IQ of 90 or has an IQ of 70, what do you do with that information? What kind of program is contained in that information? You see, so often we get these sort of labeled approaches to our children. Well, they made this score, that score, or they have a reading level of this point or that percentage point or other percentage point, but there's no information there, you see, that you can work with to transform the situation. That says, hey, if you work on this, and if you train the child in this area, if you give the child more practice at this and this point, then this particular behavior will be rectified or enhanced or stimulated for growth. The information processing approach, then, I think is a better approach for dealing with problems of this type. And this is in contrast to what we call the psychometric approach, where a child is given a test and essentially then a score is what the parent or another interested person gets, you see. We are deceived in psychology to a great extent by labels. We often think that we have information that we really don't have. To say a child is a slow learner, learning disabled, in a sense really says nothing. You know, there's really no value in that. It gives you a sense that you know what you're talking about. But in the end, when you really think about setting up a program, you have no program, you see. And to say black children have reading problems or black children have problems in math, this really says nothing at all. What can you get out of that? There's no information there. It only ends up making people feel bad and inferior and so forth, to making them feel even more frustrated and powerless in terms of how to get out of that situation. So the information processing approach emphasizes how we do what we do. How do you arrive at particular solutions? How do you arrive at a particular problem and solve that problem? The information processing theories then refer to the way people receive information. How is information taken in? And you will see here we're going to talk about input, because that is the very first segment of learning, the taking in of information. Sunday we will show you why many of our children have problems learning, because the intake process is often impaired. The attentional process is impaired in many instances, you see. The focusing of attention is impaired. A child that does not attend well, does not focus well and listens well, more than likely is a child who's going to have learning problems. Not because of any inadequacy of the brain or a capacity even to think well. The problem is the information didn't get into the system to be thought about. the search for information is unsystematic. You see, the ability to code and categorize the information is not there. So consequently, even if the information gets into the system, it cannot be processed appropriately. So then these theories look at how people, the way people receive information from the environment and the way they operate on it. It is not enough to take information into your minds, but that information must be operated on appropriately. It must be processed. It must be organized. It must be filed and categorized and classified and related to other information. There must be systems in the brain, as we say, or in the mind, that can perform those processing activities. Again, you're going to say in a minute that children have the best brains in the world. But there's a problem often with many of them in terms of how they can program information that is being made available to them. And information theories then get into the rules and the strategies and techniques that are used by the so-called intelligent people and problem-solving people to process information and use information to their advantage. And it's this kind of knowledge we have to begin to solve as a people. And they not only then look at how information is operated on, but how you integrate that information with information available in memory. I was reading here recently a book about Shaka Zulu, E.A. Ritter's book, Shaka Zulu, and I recommend that you read that book. You should get all your youngsters to read that book, particularly the males. It's so informative, and I'm not saying he's the final authority on Shaka. In fact, you should read that book along with others. But this one I find interesting because you see so much in the book. I'm going to talk a little later on about what I call the personalistic approach to history. We as African people now that we have assuaged our egos and, you know, have sort of gotten over the initial shock of the inferiority complex, it is time now for us to look more critically at ourselves and to move beyond the hero worshiping approach to history and look at it analytically for the lessons that it teaches us, you see, and look at our heroes critically and analytically so that we can gain important information and lessons for solving our problems. Merely talking about the greatness of Shaka certainly can make us feel good about ourselves, and we should feel good about ourselves. But as I've said on many other occasions, you're going to die feeling good. Yeah, many crack people out there dying feeling good. It's not enough to feel good about yourself to survive. Feeling good about your African self is not going to save your lives. Okay? Knowing that you were great kings in Egypt and great kings in the other parts of Africa is wonderful and it's necessary. But it will not solve particular problems. You have to now look at your heroes in terms of their culture, in terms of the mistakes they made, in terms of the other kind of issues that involve their lives, so that you can get the kind of information you need to survive as a people. And believe me, people, our survival is in serious question today. Very serious question. If you are going to talk about statehood, you're going to have to study statehood, the statecraft of the Egyptians. If you're going to talk about developing an African economy, you're going to have to look at the economic situation of Egypt. You have to recognize that every great civilization, African or otherwise, is based on a great economy. You cannot talk about bringing black people to greatness unless you're talking about erecting a great African economy. It's just not going to happen. So you must ask the question, how did the Egyptians support economically what they had? Because they could not be what they were unless they had an appropriate economy and unless they were appropriately economically organized. No, they weren't what they were simply because they worshipped, Ra and worshipped the others. Not by a long shot. That was a part of what they were, but it was not the complete part of who and what they were. They were also what they were because of their economic system and approaches, and those things must be understood. We must understand that history has 1,000 faces, that it is designed to answer 1,000 questions, and that looking for heroes is only one function of history. Only one. The history of our people then can be used to provide various types of answers. Economic answers, political answers, statecraft answers, political science answers, all kinds of answers can be provided by history, but you have to ask the history what? The appropriate what? The appropriate questions, you see. And so it's very important that we understand that. One of the reasons why then I mentioned shock in this situation, because when I was reading through it a couple of weeks ago, I was reading this situation of where the Zulu, some of whom they have had as many as 5,000 head of cattle, could remember individually each of those head of cattle and could tell which one was missing out of the whole lot. You see, and I bring that up, you know, to show again that the African brain is by no means suffering from any memory deficits at all. The memory of Africans was phenomenal. We often think in this day and age of note-taking and so forth that memory is a weak thing. But you must realize and take yourself back to a time when that was all people had to depend on. And recognize then that their memory capacities were developed to a very high degree of perfection. A degree of perfection that we today would be awed by. Memory is literally infinite. You can remember many, many things. Just a numberless number of things. And they were able to do that because their lives depended upon it. Their social system depended upon it. So there's nothing wrong. The other thing that I read there too was how about the complexity of the Zulu language and how there was no such thing as ungrammatical Zulu speech. You know, that these people spoke their language with clarity and spoke it well. You know, no broken Zulu and this and that, because we've accepted that too as a people. Again, what I'm trying to point out here is that when we look at the history of our people, we see the abilities that our people have. So then, to sum it up quickly, the information processing theories refer to the way people receive information from their environment, operate on it, integrate it with information available in memory, and use the product as a basis for deciding how to perform. And we're going to be back in a minute with this decision business. Information processing psychologists start their investigation with the study of how people perform on tests. You've often heard the statement that black people are not taught how to think, but what to think. That is one of the basic requirements of a servant people. That's one of the reasons why, one of the characteristics of many of our people's cognitive or thinking styles will be passive, a receptive, taking in kind of style, but not one that is flexible and productive, but one that is similar to that of parrots, of taking in, memorizing, and throwing out, and thinking that they're thinking when they're merely recalling, you see, and recalling what some white instructor has taught them, and quoting some white instructor, but not doing any original thinking on their own. So we must then look at how our children think and perform on these tests. For example, information processing psychologists would seek to identify the processes that underlie human reasoning. It's not to say that a child has a reasoning deficit. We must look at the very processes that are involved in deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, syllogistic thinking, analogical thinking, and so forth. What are the steps involved in there, in these types of thinking? And let us see then how those steps can be taught and trained into our children, if they need be. You look at the scientific method that's utilized in this culture, and you have to recognize that we are talking about a way of thinking, a way of behaving, a way of dealing with information. And we can see all around us right now the result of thinking in particular kinds of ways. We look at these TV monitors, we look at the cameras here, we look at this building. This is the result of what? Of a way of thinking. And that's all it's about. Not about brain, just a way of thinking. And therefore, at some point there, when Francis Bacon and others imposed this way of thinking on European society, we saw then a takeoff of knowledge production. We are literally being overrun with knowledge and information. But that being overrun with knowledge and information is a result of applying the scientific method, the scientific attitude of approach, of applying hypothetical thinking and approaching the development of knowledge systematically. The discovery then of information flows more out of the systematic approach than it does out of genius. I'm going to come back to that a little later on, because we've been given the genius approach to history of black people. You know, the idea that science is produced by some scientist locked away in his ivory tower, that is a lie. It's a lie. And it is not true. And that approach to science has been particularly projected on us so that so as to create an inferiority complex in us. And we have to understand that. It has to do with methods of thinking. If you follow the scientific method of thinking and approach, and you have the appropriate equipment, you are going to what? Discover something. I'll guarantee you. So tell them. It's set up for discovery. The discovery and the production is where? In what? In the method. In the way of thinking. In the way of approaching the world. That's where it is. You then, if you want to get certain things produced from your culture and from your children, you must then put into their minds the appropriate way of thinking. And they will produce it for you. And you must learn how to do it. And then proceed to do so. While there are almost as many definitions of intelligence, and I'm going to talk about intelligence here tonight, in terms of its relationship to academic achievement. We're not going to get involved in trying to decide exactly what it is. But we're talking about it in terms of that aspect of behavior and capacity that allows children to succeed in school. While there are almost as many definitions of intelligence as there are researchers, most of them center around two aspects of intelligence: goal orientation and adaptive behavior. We don't have time to discuss this evening the fact that there should be as many definitions of intelligence as there are cultures. And see, there's another one of the deception we have, and that is the idea that there should be only one definition of intelligence that should apply all across everybody. And that's going to get you in trouble the same way the concept of standard education gets you in trouble as well. The thing, though, that we are emphasizing here then is what all or most definitions of intelligence deal with, and that is goal orientation and adaptive behavior. Goal-oriented means that it is conscious and deliberate rather than accidental. So a lot of people think intelligence in its broadest sense is something that sort of happens on people and something that just sort of just automatically inherited and people have it or they don't have it. And I want you to note that intelligence is related to the setting of goals. Goals. We're going to see in a minute that one of the major reasons for the confusion of black children, one of the major reasons for the kind of educational problems African children have over the world is because we as black adults are not clear about the goals that we want to accomplish as people. Because it is the goals, you know, that we set that organizes and informs intelligence. You see, if you have no goals and no sense of purpose, then there is no organization of the intellectual capacities of your children. We're going to come back to that. You have got to have cultural goals, people. You just can't send your children to school and expect them to learn when you have no real cultural goals and directions and things you want to accomplish. The first thing they ask you is, why am I studying this mathematics? Why do I have to learn this, Mama? Why do I have to read this? And because you have no sense of where you want to go as a people, you're at a loss to tell them to. Well, you know, then get your job. Don't you want to live better than me, baby? People selling crack. You know, live there. Why do I have to go through all of this? If this is merely what it's about, you know, you've got to be able to inculcate the children with goals and have a goal orientation in order for them to organize their intelligence. And I'm going to show you, because you have let your future be determined by another people, your children's minds and brains have nowhere to go. And they have no reasons for learning. Period. The other aspect of intelligence has to do with the adaptive. The adaptive refers to the fact that intelligence consists of the ability to solve problems. Keep that in mind. To what? To solve problems. Not to score high on the IQ test. That is not intelligence. Not to score high on the SAT. That's coincidental. But to do what? Solve problems. Solve the problems that confront you as a people and solve the problems that confront you as an individual. I don't care how high you score on an IQ test. If you can't solve the problems that confront you as a people and as an individual, you are dumb. And you will be destroyed. See? And I'm telling you, you've heard me say before that regardless of the level of education of black people, from the PhD level on down, there is a certain fundamental dumbness in the black community. Yes. A dumbness. You talk about the crack dealer. Though he makes his thousands per month, and maybe millions, who still doesn't know how to launder the money, still doesn't know how to legitimize the money, gets raided and the money is stacked up in the closet. You know? Doesn't know what to do with it. Period. But he is just as stupid as a black middle classer who takes that little check and takes every ounce of that check and spends it, giving it to a white man to pay inflated rent and other kinds of stuff. Who will not save, who will not invest in the future of the children or in the future community. The same idiocy, you know, is characteristic of them both. So you have the same dumbness that runs from the highly educated right down to the one right in the street. You're basically no different. Yeah. I was talking to a Buffy one night, and he was complaining about the cars that the drug sellers were selling and the gold and stuff. I said, but really, brother, he's no fundamentally different from you. In a sense, you're just mad because he can buy the car you can buy. Because you're using that car to distinguish yourself in terms of class and, you know, in terms of who you are, in terms of your status. And he's doing the same thing. So you're functionally operating on the same plane. You see? No difference. And you're just angry that he, being in one class different from yours, is able to conspicuously consume the same way you do, and now you're having a hell of a way determining how can you be distinguished from this person here. It's the same game. You're still feeding white people. You're still buying overpriced junk and garbage. You're still imperiling the future of black people. You should study history in its real aspects. Read Barbara Tuchman's history, I forget what it's called, of the 14th century Europe. Read that. And I'm not one of these Africans to tell you you should only read African history. You need to read European history. You must understand European history. You really cannot appropriately understand African history unless you understand European history. I'm telling you, you can't do it. Because the histories are too inextricably intertwined, one with the other. You only get to know the psychology of the European by reading European history. You will know to a good extent that these great civilizations essentially were based on thievery and robbery and criminal activities. In fact, you can read the personal history of some of our most illustrious families today and quickly run into bootlegging and other kinds of illegal activity that is the basis of their fortune and influence in America today. You must recognize that war is a pretty name for robbing and thieving. Yeah, that's all it is. One country gets a gang together and decides it'll take the product of another country. They call it war. And then they make beautiful slogans and beautiful music to deceive the people so that they can participate in robbing the other people's resources and territories. Realize how many millions of people had to be killed to make this country possible. Understand what I'm saying? You've forgotten, haven't you? You've forgotten, huh? How many baby people had to be murdered, raped, tortured, robbed, dispossessed? You think you're doing nice, good people, don't you? When you read my new book, you'll see where I talk about European ethics is based on, European criminality. You robbed enough and stolen enough to be nice. That's all it is. If we took that wealth from you, you'd be out here robbing and stealing in these streets like everybody else. You're not intrinsically nice. Don't deceive yourself. Your ethics are bought and paid for. They're not intrinsic within your own character and personality. The ultimate test of one's ethical character is when one is starving and has nowhere to go. Okay? And when one is standing in front of real temptation and you have no money in your pocket. That's when your ethics are tested. Not when you got all the money to work on you take off like nice. Come on. We let these people run this game. And they have enough nerve. What am I saying here then? Intelligence then has to do with solving problems. Solving problems. You are not intelligent until you solve the problems that confront whom? You. Yes, you understand? You have let other people define intelligence as the ability to solve their problems, not your own. Their problem. They then call you intelligent when you can behave and think in a way that adds to their power and maintains their position in the world. Then you're intelligent. Then you have good character. Understand? I want you to think about what I'm saying here in a minute. You see? And their measure of intelligence then is intrinsically related to those abilities and ways of thinking that allows them to solve the problems that confront them as a people. Those African Americans then, who are often called intelligent within this system, are what I will call intellectual mercenaries. They are hired guns who then are used to solve the problems of the European corporate system and economic system, political and social system, but who, when confronted with their own problems, cannot solve their own problems. They can fly European shuttles into the space. They can light European ships up on the moon. They can sit on the board, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and direct European armies and develop military strategies for Europeans, and yet they cannot run the white man out of South Africa, and they cannot military recruitment. They cannot move Africa into the space race. They cannot get our people in a position where we can commercially exploit space and be a part of the expansion of this system into the universe. You are dumb and ignorant no matter what position you have in this society if you cannot solve those problems, ladies and gentlemen. So you got an MBA so that you can be smart and be productive, even better than the white boys are producing for Xerox and producing for IBM and all the rest. But you can't build and take over your own economic systems in Brooklyn and Harlem and the other places. You Africans let these Arabs and these other groups have control of your economy and control of your system. I don't care how much you can go to Cambridge and how many Rhodes scholars you produce and so forth. If you can't solve the starvation of African people, if you cannot move Africa to a position of technological challenge to other powers, if you cannot solve the issue of securing the survival of African people, you are dumb and stupid. I don't care about it. Therefore, you must define intelligence in terms of your own goals, in terms of your own survival. You must organize the thinking of children and the behavior of your children in terms of your own survival, not in terms of supporting the survival of another people. When you organize the intelligence of these children in terms of the interest of another people, you are making your children traitors to your own causes. Colin Powell will direct armed assaults on African nations and African people. And I bet you couldn't get it to organize an army in Africa against the colonial and other forces in Africa. Understand what I'm saying? You have to look at intelligence. You can't accept this standard definition of intelligence. Screw the white folks' definition of intelligence. You must look at it in terms of what do we need to survive? What do we need to be liberated? What do we need as a people to secure our survival? So in this sense, the intelligence involves the constant active interaction between so-called inherited ability and environmental experience. Really, we're going to see intelligence and environment is essentially one and the same thing. We talk about them for convenience as if they're different things, but they are really one and the same thing. Intelligence and behavior and so forth only can make sense within the context of an environment. Otherwise, they have no meaning at all, no value whatsoever. Yeah, no value at all. You can't separate intelligence from environment. Yeah, or goal orientation or problem solving has no meaning. It only has meaning within a particular context and reflects that context. You can't have criminality where boys kill each other over sneakers in a society that doesn't sell sneakers, can you? No. So in a sense, almost every crime is a social act. Almost every behavior is a social act, you see, defined by a social environment and a social system in which that act takes place. And so is the case with intelligence. In a sense, you cannot be the same as white folk unless you what? Are white folk. No matter how you try. no matter how you play it, no matter how you do it. You exist in a context that is unique to you. You are confronted with problems that are unique to you. You have goals that are unique to you. You live under conditions that are unique to you. You have a history that is unique to you, and you cannot be a white person. And a white person cannot be you. And when you then try to get to be a white person, you are merely going to drive yourself crazy and be inappropriate for yourself and not going to be able to solve your problems. It's not going to happen. I have to tell people, when you take a course in college, the course is not only defined by its subject matter, you see, and this is the problem often you have with black students in certain classes. They look at the book and they think that what's in the book is what the course is. You know, and I've told you about this situation where often when you're talking about subject matter that's not in the book and the students are looking in the book to see if what you're talking about is there, and they decide if it's not there, then you must be off the subject. You know, or you must not be talking psychology, you must be talking something else, because they don't see the guy who wrote the book called Introduction to Psychology talking about this. And then you run to the dean, we're being miseducated, he's not teaching us what's in the book. You know? As if, you know, psychology is defined by the author. That's the reason I'm saying even in totally black classes, the white man is still sitting there with that book. You know, directing the course, directing people's mind. You can see, as I've said before, people's mind turn off, you know, as soon as they don't see it in the book. Their mind just shut down. You can look at their eyes and it just shut down. They don't hear you anymore. And then when you get back to the book, they wake up, you know, they get back into it because they figure that's going to be on the test. That's what you're trying to tell them, you know. Look, when I'm off the book, I'm talking about the most important things around. You see, what are we saying here then? That a course is not only defined by its so-called subject matter or its subject, but a course is defined by its problems. You see, by the problems a particular people have to solve. So white psychology books, white sociology books, white books on economics and education and so forth are in part determined to a significant degree by the problems that whites face in these particular areas. You see? And when you take an issues course, it would be an issues course that determines their problems, not yours. That is why, despite the fact that you come out with a head full of knowledge and information, you are still unable to apply that information to your own circumstances. Understand? The economic problems of white folk are not the economic problems of black folk. You see, you got very different economic organizations of the black community. You have very different issues to deal with. How do you get black folk to spend money with black folk? How do you organize the money that black people have such that money can be used to produce commercial and business growth and development? What is the psychology that makes black folk feel good when they give all that money to white folk? How can you as a retailer get around that kind of psychology if you were a business person? Those are black issues and black problems, you know. How can we get control of the importation of all African products? You see, how do we get control of the distribution of African products within the United States economic system? How do we take over the United States economic system? Those are black problems. Those are black economic problems. How, given the fact that by mid-next century, white people will be a minority in the United States, over 50% of the jobs in this country will be held by minorities. You see, how do we take advantage of that situation and change this economic system around and make it an African one? And then connect it and organize it in its relationship to African countries. Those are the dissertations you should be writing. Those are the master's thesis you should be getting into. Those are the kind of issues you should be doing in your business courses and so forth. If you are not doing those, you are not doing Afrocentric business. You understand? You understand that? You can only solve problems based on the information available in your head by using that information, contrasting, comparing, approaching it hypothetically, and so forth, to arrive at possible answers and approaches to problems. How do you solve an African problem without African information in your head? You got a problem, haven't you? Even if you're able to think well abstractly, even if you're able to think well conceptually, ladies and gentlemen, even if you're able to do mathematics very, very well, you're still going to have a problem because you don't have the fundamental operation. You don't have the fundamental what? Information that is necessary to the solution of a problem. You see? So the mere training in thinking, or the mere training in abstract reasoning and so forth, while good is not good enough, knowledge is not good enough. It's not enough. You got to have more than knowledge. You got to have other things. You got to have uses for that knowledge. And knowledge is organized by goals, by intentions, by plans. We're going to talk a little bit about that. It's why it's so important for you to have a sense of nation as a people. Because if you don't have a sense of nation, you can have a fund of knowledge, but still perish. African people have a tremendous amount of knowledge and skill. It's just unbelievable. If we were a nation with the kind of knowledge we have, the skills we have, we would be one of the major nations on this earth. You see? But because there is no overarching national goal, no national program, no national administration among black people, that knowledge just sits in isolated bits and pieces, and it's uncoordinated and cannot be used to solve the people's problems or secure their survival. It's the same situation where black people sit with billions of dollars in their pockets and have no economic system. Because an economic system is not the same thing as money. The emphasis is on system. It is on the fact that people must have a particular set of relationships with each other and a particular way of allocating and distributing money and distributing their talents and skills and so forth that makes an economic system. Economic systems existed prior to money. The ultimate economic system depends upon social organization and depends upon the nature of a relationship between people, not the mere existence of money. And therefore, here we are as a people with billions of dollars and no economic and social and political influence in America to count for. It's a shame. Why? Is it because you didn't have Andrew Bremer up on the board or whatever, the federal board? That you don't have PhDs in economics? Huh? Hey, educated the wrong way. Intelligence only organized to solve what? Other people's problems, not their own problems. Purpose organizes intelligence. Gives it a reason for being. It begins with focusing one's attention on something. It begins with seeing a problem to be solved. You see, it begins there. We'll see in a second how that works. Intelligence involves the constant interaction between inherited ability and environmental experience, which results in an individual's being able to acquire the appropriate information for solving a problem, to remember the necessary information for solving a problem, to use knowledge, to understand both concrete and abstract concepts, to understand the relationships among objects, the relationship between things, events and ideas, and to apply this understanding to use all of the above in solving the problems of everyday life. And this is what it's about. If you don't see a problem, how do you organize your intelligence to solve it? How do you know what information is necessary to acquire to solve it? How do you know what behavioral orientations are necessary to solve the problem? One of the major problems I have, ladies and gentlemen, as I move around this lecture circuit, is trying to get our people to see that we have problems.
Yes, sir. No problem. No problem.
Real problems.
Right.
That our very lives are threatened as people. That our existence, our biological existence on this earth is in question. Serious question. It has been projected by the year 2000, 42% of the black population of the United States will have AIDS. That AIDS is running rampant over the African continent. That is a problem. That problem must be solved. Not by white folk, but by black folk.
Yes, sir.
Now, once you recognize that that is a problem, you then begin to ask yourself, what kind of information must we gather to solve this problem appropriately? How must we organize our society? How must we organize the economic system? How must we organize the educational approach of our children? How must we organize the college and the university and so forth? How must we organize the hospital system? How must we organize the infrastructural road systems and other systems so that we can meet this challenge and survive as a people? That is what intelligence is about, you see. Then you look, well, he has this information. She has that information. She has this skill. They have this skill. Then how do we coordinate this kind of thing? This money is available. How do we get this money and reroute it in this direction so we can solve this particular problem? But you got to first see the problem. And many of our people don't see the problem. Consequently, they don't develop the appropriate skills and abilities to solve the problem. They don't have that sense of urgency that makes them make those children go down to school and learn what they're supposed to learn. Because you know what? That Lord is going to take care of you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's coming soon.
Yeah. I'm not going to get into a thing I've been doing before in these other lectures. Maybe I'll come back and deal with you again on that. You know, this law business. It just moves total responsibility, you know, from us. Oh, we don't have to think and work and so forth. But some of you might have attended my lecture out at Rockdale and out in New Jersey. So I've heard me deal with that issue before when I used the book of Moses, Exodus, to show that even though the law that these was there, and even though these were the chosen people of God, they had to get out and fight their own battles.
Amen. Yes.
They had to study war.
Right.
They had to practice government. They had to practice political science.
Yes.
They had to plan and organize and do all of these things, and yet they were supposed to be what? The chosen people.
Right.
You understand? Being the chosen people didn't mean that they couldn't take their own survival into their own hands. I talked about the situation where God told Moses sent some spies over into the land of Canaan and to collect intelligence about the organization of this land. He had even promised them that land, didn't he? Remember? The promised land we always think about somebody? promised it to him, saying, we're going to give it to you now. But, you know, he just didn't do what? He just didn't hand it over to them, ladies and gentlemen. No. And so he comes to Moses and say, what? Moses, I want you to send people over there for 40 days to collect information and intelligence about this country, its fortifications, its designs, about its army, about its food system, and the whole thing, and bring it back so that you can make your plans of war and so forth based on this information. Now here's this all-seeing God, this all-knowing God, telling them to do what? You get the information. When he could have just said, hey, here it is, this is the way it's laid out. Or just went over there and smoked the people there and said, walk on there and take it, children. Didn't do that, did he? And he's not going to do it for you. Didn't give you a brain, didn't give you a mind so that you couldn't use it. And you could just lay back and lean on Jesus. No, that's not the way it's set up. You're going to have to use your mind. And you're going to have to fight your battles. And you're going to have to confront your enemies. And you're going to have to solve your problems. And you're going to have to study and work and struggle and suffer. When you were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, they told you you're going to have to earn it by the what? The sweat of your brow. Now you got to sweat it out. That's what it's about. But we got some people here who want to lay back. It doesn't work that way. You got to deal with it like it is. You got to recognize that you have a problem. That's the first essence of intelligence. And then you got to collect the relevant information and knowledge and the relevant mental strategies to solve those problems. You're looking over here at Europe being reorganized. And ain't we happy, all that freedom just flowing over there? You know, this magazine came out, Newsweek, February 22nd, 1988, and you see the cover, The Pacific Century. And in this particular cover, of course, they are talking about, will the next century belong to whom? The Asians. That's why it's called the Pacific Century. Is America in decline? And I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if America is in decline, you're in a hell of a shape. Hello. Because, you know, there used to be a correlation between a decline in the price of cotton and the number of black people hung. Yeah, in the South, you know, as the cotton price went down, the number of black people sprung up to freeze went up. That's a hard fact of life, ladies and gentlemen. When this country declines in its economic power and so forth, you are going to be hung. And I mean literally. You know, and you have to understand that. That's why you got to know what's going on nationally and internationally. So this country went through this whole bit about the Asians. And you know, I often ask this question, are we to get out from under the foot of the white man only to fall under the foot of the Asian? Which is what it looks like is developing here. That is a problem. Your children have got to be educated to solve that problem. However, they cannot be educated unless you yourself are educated, because it is adults who educate children. And you must then see to your own education. The Pacific Century. But there's something mysterious going on here. Maybe the Europeans have decided that it's not going to be what? A Pacific Century. Huh? Maybe they have seen this Japanese-Asian situation developing and realize that they can no longer maintain their tribal problems, that they have to get over their divisions in Western Europe and cut out spending their money for bombers and weapons and all this other garbage that has drained their talent and skewed their scientific orientation in such a way that they cannot commercially compete with the Japanese. So maybe they're recognizing now that it is time to end their tribal rivalries and reorganize the European continent in such a way that they can prevent the Asian century from taking over. Problem for African people, isn't it? Now, we used to could play one European contingent against another. The Eastern European contingent against the Western European contingent. separation based on having them play one against the other. What happens when they are both on the same side? Huh? We got a problem here. You understand? It used to be that Eastern Europe was shut out of the World Bank and shut out of the IMF and the other places that our nations used to beg. Now they're coming online, and they are going to now hog the trough as well, which means then the crumbs that the African nations used to get, they are no longer assured of getting in the future. You have a problem here. You understand? A major problem. And African people on the continent and in America must be prepared to solve that problem. And that means their educational system and the intellectual rules and approaches to life must be drastically changed. And the children must be educated to undertake the task that confront us as a people. You must understand that. So you're going to see, before long, I would predict, East Germans in New York City taking your place. You see, Hungarians and all the other ones that where they don't have any room for in Europe, over here competing with you, Russian Jews and the other types coming in. You have to understand, it's one thing to be for immigration and so forth, but you got to sit and think a little bit before you just open the doors and just let everybody flood in, particularly when everybody floods in over your back. And where your community is pointed out to as the greatest pickings in the world. You see, there's a problem there. What black men and women have been prepared to solve that problem? Both the mind and the electronic computer are information processing systems consisting of hardware and software. In other words, we get the information processing approach from the electronic computer. Computer hardware refers to the physical aspects of the machine. The key humans. The software consists of the plans, programmed instructions. In other words, the computer doesn't run by itself, does it? The computer, no matter how good, no matter how powerful, must be what? Programmed. It must be instructed. It must be organized to deal with the information that will be placed into it. And that information must be placed into it systematically so that it can be processed systematically. You know the common phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Information comes in the wrong way, you're going to get a wrong answer. So the software consists of the plans and programmed instructions that tell the machine how to organize, retrieve, and operate on the information it receives. The mind's physical machinery or hardware consists of the brain, nervous system, and sensory receptors. In other words, our senses are the things that take in the information. That's why we focus them. We call it attention or orientation. The first part of learning is the appropriate focusing of the sensory system to take in appropriate information and of closing out from the mind and rejecting irrelevant information. If you have no problems, if you have no question, you don't know what is relevant or irrelevant. I tell my students this all the time. If you read this textbook and do not remember the chapter title, if you do not change the headings into questions, you will go into the paragraphs not knowing what you're looking for. You won't know what to underline or not underline. All of these sentences have equal weight. You're in a quandary now because you must try to remember everything. You cannot categorize and classify and add weights to various bits and pieces of information and appropriately organize that information, which is one of the reasons now you are going to have problems on the exam. Because you did not approach your reading with what? Purpose. The world is filled with information. Information all over the place, everywhere, all the time. There are so many things you can look at and notice right now. But because you came with a purpose, you are directing your sensory equipment. And that equipment now is picking up, and you have told it, I want you to pick up this information store this information and so forth, and it doesn't. But without purpose. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, looking is not seeing. Seeing is not merely an act of having your eyes opened and allowing stimuli to fall upon your retinas. It's more than that. An Eskimo can differentiate over 24 different types of snow on sight. How many can you differentiate? Powders, flurry, or whatever. Why? And now, if you were next to that Eskimo and he started pointing out all this different type, you could not what? See it. Even though your eyes are as good or better than his. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, the act of seeing is also an intellectual act. The act of seeing must be guided by a program, or else you don't know what to look for, and your eyes will not have the correct acuity and cannot differentiate the environment or the system you're looking at. Look at the difference between a trained biologist looking through a microscope and picking out all kinds of bodies and organelles and this and that in a cell, and then the student looking through it and seeing nothing but a gray mass of material there. How do you see that? And his eyes may be worse than yours in terms of their actual acuity. But what? He has what? A program, a set of experiences. He has a motivational system. The Eskimo must see these different forms of life because of what? Because their life what? Depends on it. You see? And when you connect things then to your survival, when you connect things to the enhancement of your life, to your empowerment, to your liberation, you are going to see a different world from the one you will see if you did not do these things. Right. Every state of consciousness carries with it a different organization of the world. You notice that? If you're into different things, you deal with different people. You see different sides of town. You get into different information. The world is created by consciousness. You see? So therefore, you have to have a plan. And this often then is missing. You will not see the information that you need to see if you don't see a problem or an issue to be dealt with. So you will have the bourgeois Negro saying, I don't see it. I don't see it that way. Now, you can't see it. That's the nature of attention. Attention and strong concentration literally blinds you to irrelevant things. You know? Even though those things may be right in front of your eyes. But since you're not looking for that particular thing at that particular moment, since you're emotionally hooked up into something else, in a sense you literally do not see it. You see? And consequently then, in order for us to be in the condition we're in, ladies and gentlemen, we must not be able to see the obvious. You understand? That's why I said earlier, we have to have a certain fundamental dumbness, blindness, even though we may be very well educated. Because that education is also an education into ignorance as well as knowledge. Because when you're focusing on one thing and learning one thing, you ignore another. And if you never focus on the things you ignore, you become what? Ignorant of those things. So therefore, in a sense, education is both a movement into knowledge and a movement into what? Ignorance. Understand? And when you let other people then define your problems for you and define what you are attending to, the very educational process itself becomes one of making you ignorant. And white people depend upon our ignorance, whether educated or otherwise, to maintain their power over us. I'll speed on here. I guess we've reached the hour now.
No, take your time. Good stuff.
Keep me going. I'll rush through it then. That's my problem. We'll finish the other part in the next lecture. I'll just quickly develop these points. The black child's hardware. The idea is that the black child has no hardware problems. We have the best brains in the world. The very best, no doubt about it. Let's look at the New York Times, April 4th, 1989. In the science section of that newspaper, had an article titled, "Infant IQ Test Found to Predict Scores in School." Doctors are already identifying babies who are at academic risk. I could do something with that one. Yeah. Very interesting situation there. To the surprise of many psychologists, and I'm quoting from the article, tests on infants as young as 6 months of age are predicting their scores on intelligence tests years later when they start school. Understand what we're saying here? We are now gaining the capacity as psychologists to look at some behavioral characteristics of infants as young as 6 months old and predict their IQ scores at ages 4, 5, and up to 7 years of age. Yeah, and that's very interesting. I think you'll get the context when I finish it. Dr. Fagan, who's one of the researchers in this area, recently reported that he can also identify babies likely to be above average in intelligence. He reports that he can now test babies in the first year of life and pick out those who are likely to be above average in intelligence at age 3. Very interesting situation here, isn't it?
Yes.
In other words, we not only can tell about those babies that are at risk, that will more than likely suffer as a result of low intelligence, we now will be able to differentiate those that will be above average intelligence. In other words, those that will succeed in the schools very well. They are the first baby tests that may have any predictive value. The tests attempt to measure what babies remember. You see, babies are born with far more capacity than we give them credit for. Developmental psychology is one of the fastest growing areas of psychology in terms of research and real factual findings today. And it's interesting because of the fact that you would think it would be slow because babies can't talk and the whole bit. But very interestingly, you can come to understand a great deal about babies without their having to talk or to communicate one with the other. And you can pick up many verifiable facts about the developmental characteristics of babies as early as 1 and 2 years days old. Infants like to look at new patterns more than at familiar ones. If they can tell the newborn, if they can tell the new from the old, they are demonstrating a visual recognition memory. In other words, we look at the baby's visual focus. What is the baby looking at? And we use its visual focusing orientations to determine something about its memory capacities, you see, and its capacities to process information and take information in, its capacities to compare and contrast information, you see, because of the fact that a baby will look longer at a stimulus that is new to it than it will at one that is familiar. So consequently, if you project on that baby's retina or in that baby's sight a particular stimulus repetitively, after a while the baby, like we all, will get tired of looking at it. It's what we call habituation. We'll say, well, I've seen this before. You know, same old thing, nothing interested in it. It's not going to threaten me, it's no problem to me, so I can forget about that. And that's really the function of the human senses, by the way. The function of the human senses is to detect change. You see, Once the environment becomes unchanging and unthreatening, the senses, in a sense, just sort of leave it alone. It's only those new things, those unfamiliar things, that pose a possible threat to survival. So consequently, when you've gotten used to an environment, and the environment is constant, the senses, in a sense, are just sort of shut down. But as soon as something changes over, they come right into action because there's a possible threat. There's a possible threat to survival. So you see this in the infant, in the earliest days and hours of life. It was born 5 months ahead of time to have this capacity. So they're born with this thing and say, hey, new thing in town, let me check it out, see what's happening here, if this is a threat to me or not. Its ability then to habituate and what we call dishabituate, that is when it sees a new stimulus, to react again, and to, when two stimuli, one which is familiar, one new is shown to it, to focus more on the new as against the old, indicates then that it remembers the old, you see, and that it is performing comparative processes, you see, and things like that. So there are things going on, that it has a memory capacity, and it is using that memory capacity to orient its attention and orient its behavior. So then you see intelligence, and the central issue of intelligence, adaptability, and the protection of oneself against threat, operating at the very earliest stages of life. So in a sense, people often do not have the sense that they're born with. Yeah. In order for us to be in the condition we are in, we don't have the sense that we were born with. You literally have to be robbed of what we call common sense. You see, those senses have to be what? Perverted and converted. That's what happens. In theory, babies will look at a new stimulus for a longer time than the one they remember having seen before. Babies that are likely to be below average in intelligence will remember fewer of the stimuli they have seen before. Isn't it interesting how you can use very simple paradigms to get at things? It also indicates the immense value of the visual sense to what we call intelligence, and how intricately and inexplicably it is related to what we call intellectual functioning, you see, such that we can look at this infant's visual behavior and relate it to its vocabulary power later on in its years as well. But of course, isn't that what reading is about? Visual discrimination, the capacity to tell the difference between one letter and another, one word and another, and to process those differences into information and knowledge, and to use that knowledge to solve problems. So should it come as a surprise that we can literally just flash a little spot of light on an infant's retina and get some sense of how that infant is going to behave later on in life? It's there, you see. We complicate matters, but it's there. Researchers at Albert Einstein College of Medicine found that a baby's performance at age 4 months and 6 months on a test of visual memory correlate with IQ at 4 and 6 years of age. The predictions are independent of the parents' education and income group, which are also correlated with IQ. The infant's tests seem to indicate that visual memory, which is already linked to IQ, in later years may be fundamentally tied to the workings of the mind. Visual memory may be a central aspect of intelligence from infancy onward. A very interesting situation sets up here, doesn't it? Is indicated here. Because I have before me a book, not before me a book, but a piece of an article taken from a book written by Eysenck. Those of you who are familiar with Eysenck as a psychologist know that he is sort of in the Shockley school of psychologists relative to the intelligence of black children. And he has as a portion of this book a schematic diagram that shows brainwave patterns. The idea that we can look at brainwave patterns and relate those brainwave patterns to what is called in this culture IQ. Okay? And we can look then at those patterns and use them to measure a person's intelligence is measured by the IQ test. It states here, brainwaves resulting from a sudden stimulus, that is that flash of light, but of course what is happening here, you flash a dot of light onto the baby's retina, and of course that light, that information is registered in the brain. And of course that registration of information and processing is picked up by an EEG system. So you can see how the brain reacts. We call this the evoked potential. In a sense, a reaction has been evoked in the brain, and we pick up that evoked reaction. And of course, the evoked reaction is presented as a type of wave form, you see, and with heights and peaks. Brain waves resulting from a sudden stimulus. The waves are evoked potentials recorded on an electroencephalograph, and the score used is the wavelength of the first 4 waves to occur. Note that the wavelengths are shortest for the brightest and longest for the dullest subject. In other words, transmission of information is quick for bright and slow for dull subjects. Dangerous information there, ladies and gentlemen. And he does a whole series of charts. You can't see them from here, where he correlates length of brainwave patterns with IQ, and he shows you the differences of various IQ levels and different brainwave patterns correlated with those IQ levels. That's very interesting. Let us quote from Jensen for a minute. It has been noted that the brainwave patterns in African newborn infants show greater maturity than is usually found in the European newborn child. This finding especially merits further study, since there is evidence that the brain waves have some relationship to IQ, and since at least one aspect of the brain waves, the visually evoked potential, has a very significant genetic component, showing a heritability of about 0.8. You understand what I'm getting at here? What are we saying? When you check the EEG reaction of the black newborn child, that EEG reaction indicates that the black newborn child is born at a more advanced stage of intellectual development than is the European child. Understand what we're saying here? If you are going to measure the wavelength as a correlate of intelligence, then you would have to say that the black child is genetically more intelligent than the European. I'm using that information, not my own. And that's why you hear Jensen says it requires what? Further study. You notice the qualification here? There's a problem here. There's a problem here. Because when you look at this black child and study the EEG pattern, and since we have already noted that there's a correlation, and a strong correlation between the visually evoked potential and IQ, and this black child's evoked potential is more advanced than the European ones, if you